Jessica Mitford was the second youngest of the 6 Mitford sisters. From her teenage years onwards, she defined herself as a rebellious spirit, reacting against her family's affinity for fascism to go and fight for the communist cause in the Spanish Civil War. After this, she moved to America, where she established herself as one of the great investigative journalists of the 20th century. Join me as we explore her story. Jessica Lucy Freeman Mitford, who would be known as Decca by those who knew her from her early years onwards, was born on the 11th of September 1917 at Astle Manor in Oxfordshire. Jessica's father was David Bertram Ogilvy Freeman Mitford, 2nd Baron Ruysdael, while her mother was Sydney Bowles, who hailed from a prominent political and business family which had founded notable magazines. Consequently, Jessica came from a family which was involved in writing and publishing, backgrounds which would impact on her life profoundly. Also, Jessica arrived into a large family. She had 4 older sisters, Nancy, Pamela, Diana and Unity, and a brother Tom, while one more sister, Deborah, followed in 1920. Jessica and her siblings had a somewhat dysfunctional upbringing. Their parents were eccentrics who largely homeschooled them, though by the time that Jessica was born, this idea had been relaxed somewhat, and Jessica had some limited formal schooling, though she was largely self-taught in terms of much of her reading and political views. By the early 1930s, as Jessica entered her teenage years, the Mitford family was becoming increasingly divided politically. The middle Mitford sisters Diana and Unity, and the sole brother Tom, were advocates of fascism. Moreover, when Diana began a relationship with Oswald Mosley, the head of the British Union of Fascists in 1932, the family's ties to the British fascist movement became very real indeed, while from 1933, Diana and Unity were spending increasing amounts of time in Germany, attending Nazi gatherings and associating with Hitler and the other leaders of the Nazi Party. This manifested itself at home in Oxfordshire, where Jessica and Unity, who were closest in age, became antagonistic towards each other, as Jessica increasingly favoured socialism and communism, the ideological enemy of fascism. As a result, she was known as the Red Sheep of the family. In the spring of 1937, Jessica, at just 19 years of age, made national headlines in Britain. Shortly before this, she had met and quickly fallen in love with Esmond Romilly, a British socialist, anti-fascist, and nephew-in-law of Winston Churchill, the future Prime Minister of Britain and war leader. Mitford and Romilly were being reported on in the newspaper that spring, as they had eloped from Britain and headed for Spain to support the communist and republican movement there in the Civil War against the nationalists, who would eventually fall under the absolute command of General Francisco Franco. Jessica and Esmond arrived to Spain later that spring, where they remained, despite the dispatch of a British warship to the region to try and bring home this daughter of a British aristocrat and nephew-in-law of one of the nation's foremost political figures. However, once their Spanish visas were threatened with revocation, they agreed to pass back over the border to France. There they were married in a civil ceremony at Bayonne on the 18th of May 1937. The young couple remained in France for some time, with hopes of returning to Spain to report on the war, but eventually had to abandon this aim. They consequently returned to London, where Esmond worked on a memoir entitled Boadilla, an account of his time with the English Brigade fighting with the communists in Spain back in 1936, before Jessica joined him on his travels. There they lived in the East End, in an apartment that a friend of Esmond had provided to them. Tragically, a daughter named Jessica after her mother, who was born in December 1937, died the following May from a measles outbreak in the British capital. Jessica and Esmond did not remain in England long after returning there. In February 1939, they emigrated to the United States, where they lived a largely penniless itinerant lifestyle, despite their affluent backgrounds. Eventually they settled in Greenwich Village in New York, which was already developing its reputation as a bohemian heartland in Lower Manhattan. There Jessica briefly found work at a fashion house, while Esmond attempted to find work as a journalist. This brief period was interrupted when the Second World War broke out in Europe in September 1939, as the fascists Jessica had always deplored went to war with her native country. Esmond immediately headed for Canada to enlist in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Jessica spent the early years of the war living with Virginia and Clifford Durr, two civil rights activists who lived in Washington, D.C. There, Decca gave birth to a daughter that she named Constancia in February 1941. Sadly, Constancia's father would be dead before her first birthday. Esmond went missing in action while flying in an air raid against the city of Hamburg in Germany on the 30th of November 1941. It is assumed that his plane was lost over the North Sea. He was just 23 years of age at the time. Jessica responded to the disappearance of her husband by burying herself in work, volunteering with numerous organizations in the US as the country was drawn into the conflict just a week after Romilly's death following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. During the course of this, she met Robert Troyhalf, a Harvard Law graduate who became involved in the civil rights movement along with her, even before the war ended. The movement was gathering pace at this time, as civil rights leaders argued that African Americans needed to have equal rights in the United States when they began arriving home from Europe and the Pacific after the war, having fought for their country. Jessica and Troyhalf married in 1943, and she became a US citizen the following year. They had two sons soon after. Nicholas was born in 1944, with Benjamin arriving in 1947. Sadly, Nicholas died when still a child in 1955 after being hit by a bus. By that time, his parents were heavily involved in the civil rights movement in America and had also joined the Communist Party of the United States, a political affiliation which became extremely hazardous during Senator Joseph McCarthy's communist witch hunts during the 1950s. As the mother, Jessica clearly left a lot to be desired. Interviewed in 2006, her children, Constancia from her marriage to Romilly, and Benjamin born to her and Troyhalf, stated that she was not a neglectful mother, but her work was always a priority over motherhood. She had little time for the intricacies of raising children, and was not exactly a homemaker, rarely undertaking housework or cooking. Her children called her Decca rather than Mum, while Benjamin claimed that he had largely been raised by his older half-sister rather than his mother. While her parenting style was less than perfect, Jessica flourished as a writer in the post-war period. She contributed to numerous publications in the 1950s before publishing her first book in 1960, a celebrated memoir entitled Ons and Rebels. This autobiographical account of her upbringing presented a picture of herself protesting against the growing inclination of her family towards fascism. In one memorable passage, she describes her sister Unity carving swastikas into the windows of their Oxfordshire manor in the 1930s, over which Jessica subsequently carved the Soviet hammer and sickle. The memoir became a classic and has been widely praised since by figures as notable as Christopher Hitchens and J.K. Rowling. The 1960s were a remarkable period in the history of the United States and in Jessica Mitford's life. It all kicked off for her with encounters with the Ku Klux Klan, the Freedom Riders, and Martin Luther King in 1961. On a research trip to Montgomery, Alabama, one of the most significant sites in the ongoing civil rights movement, Mitford and a friend ended up meeting a group of Freedom Riders, civil rights activists who rode buses between American towns and cities to drum up support for an end to segregation of black and white Americans in the southern states. Shortly afterwards, the group was attacked by a branch of the Ku Klux Klan, following which Mitford made her way to a gathering at which King was a prime speaker. The Klan again sent a group to break up the rally in what was a striking introduction to the South and its politics for Mitford. Shortly thereafter, Mitford's attention was drawn away from the American South to the funeral industry in the United States. She began investigating the more nefarious elements of an industry which pretended to be directed towards helping grieving people, but which Mitford increasingly came to believe was exploiting them. The result in 1963 was a new book entitled The American Way of Death. In this, Mitford argued that funeral directors across the United States were exploiting the shock and grief experienced by the bereaved to convince the families and loved ones of those who had died to pay for an array of services which they didn't really need. This ranged from lavish funeral services and ornate coffins to the provision of grief counsellors. A particularly striking aspect of this was her description of mortuary practices, which were deemed to be so graphic by the standards of the 1960s that Jessica initially struggled to find a publisher. She also described at length the manner in which grieving families were sold designer clothes to dress the dead, and everything from expensive cosmetics and grooming to teeth whitening were added onto bills. Mitford's research was meticulous, based on records she consulted from funeral parlours and state records offices in various parts of the country. The book subsequently became a bestseller and led to a congressional hearing in Washington, D.C. to deliberate on whether the funeral industry needed to be more tightly regulated across the country. With the publication of Ons and Rebels and The American Way of Death, Jessica became a well-established literary figure and social commentator in the United States. She consequently became a regular article writer of numerous publications such as The Atlantic Monthly and Vanity Fair. Many of her pieces continue to skew corporate America and its practices, and Decker became known as one of the preeminent muckrakers of her day. Other journalism focused on the Vietnam War and the draft and the prison system, which at the time was already expanding to become the prison industrial complex of the late 20th and early 21st centuries in America. The latter reporting was published as a book in 1973 entitled Kind and Unusual Punishment: The Prison Business. She also published many other books over the years, including The Trial of Dr. Spock, The Making of a Muckraker, and The American Way of Birth, among others. Decker also taught at several institutions from the late 1960s onwards, notably at San Jose State University, not far from San Francisco, where she had lived with her 2 surviving children and second husband for the most part since the mid-1940s. This latter position became a cause célèbre in 1973 when Mitford refused to acquiesce to a demand that all staff wear an oath of allegiance to the Constitution of the United States, which, combined with her known position as a prominent communist during the 1950s, led to campus protests both for and against her continued presence as a lecturer there. In 1977, she published a second memoir called A Fine Old Conflict, which largely dealt with her experiences as a member of the US Communist movement in the 1940s and 1950s, a movement which she had since departed from and was critical of in many respects. Though there was a lighter side to Decker. In the 1970s, she recorded some music albums, while her television appearances in the 1980s showed a light-hearted, witty side to her personality, despite the seriousness of the topics which she had dealt with in her work over the decades. In the 1990s, she became ill with lung cancer and eventually died from the disease in the summer of 1996, aged 78. Her wishes, in line with her criticism of the funeral industry over the years, were for an inexpensive ceremony. When the cremation costs were taken out of the equation, it cost just $58. Her ashes were scattered at sea. A memorial service was held in San Francisco, where famous speakers praised her mordant sense of humor and lifelong unorthodoxy. At the time of her death, the San Francisco Chronicle wrote, "In this strangely flat era of diversity, she was the rarest of birds, an exotic creature who rose each morning to become the sun around whom thousands of lives revolved." She was survived by her husband Robert Troyhaff, who died 5 years later, and by her children Constancia Romilly and Benjamin Troyhaff, both of whom are still alive as of the making of this video, and are 82 and 75 respectively. Thank you everyone so much for watching this video on Jessica Mitford. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and if you have any other suggestions, also be sure to leave them in the comments. This was the penultimate Mitford sister. Soon I'll have the last video on Deborah Mitford, and if you want to check out any other videos on the Mitford sisters, they are all on the channel. Anyway, I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.